Namaste, Assalamu alaikum, Shalom, Ni hao, Buenos tardes, buenos dias, Heseche, Aquaba, welcome in, what up though? This is Cafe Melange, week numero 19, the Pongo. And continuing in these unintended soliloquies, but with a topic. Actually, those topics, those cosas. First topic involves, God bless you, the experience of tension, intra-melange tension, amidst different experiences, denominations, or however you like to identify such within the melange experience, specifically Creole and Hapa. So before getting into that though, it's beneficial to provide some context. This is specifically pertaining to the melange experience in the United States and Canada, effectively as well, the land of First Nations, Native Brethren, and additionally Turtle Island. So to understand the context, the historic and contemporary and continuing context, is beneficial to recognize the different types of melange experience that existed on this land. So the first is Métis, the people who are mixed heritage between predominantly European and Native brethren. But particularly within the United States, the Métis community is fairly quiet because the numbers are very modest. Similarly, within Canada, although there is the Métis National Council with different provincial administrations that organize and advocate for the Métis community. That's the first. That's the first experience of melange on this continent, as it is known contemporary conventionally. The biggest experience of melange on this continent is actually Latinos. But the thing about Latinos is that Latinos don't identify too tough in the Eurocentric kind of context of melange. Latinos are Latinos, and plus it's a different language than the English, predominantly English speaking. So there's a different bag. Melange itself is intrinsically interlingual, multilingual, omniglottic. However, the experience of identifying as melange, particularly on this continent, exists within a very Eurocentric convention, and so Latinos are comparatively distinct from that experience. So, long story short, don't identify too much as melange. Just identify as a distinct entity, a distinct ethnic community, cultural community, and additionally. So, the first is Métis. The biggest is Latino. It may be considered that the most predominant, and that's a little bit of a charged word, it's a little bit inaccurate, but the most readily recognized, the most readily visible, and the biggest within the Eurocentric convention of this continent is that of Creole. So it's known by many names, many derogatory names as well, which is why I abstain from referring to it as such. One of which I'll just say, because that's what many people are familiar with, mulatto, which just means mule, literally. So obviously it's a derogatory, dehumanizing word. So, but basically describes the experience of someone who was born of predominantly European and African ancestry. And it exists for a long-standing time, centuries. Very charged experience, charged history, charged politics, religiosity, and additionally. But very large, very, very pervasive, millions and millions on this continent. So that's the one we talk about, Creole. Then one other one is Hapa. And Hapa is, as I described previously, ancestry that is mixed between or amongst European, or excuse me, just Asian but effectively European and Asian, Eurasian. Um, and so uh, the Hapa experience on this continent is comparatively new because of the migration and the emergence of uh, Hapa people, Hapa brethren, um, within the past century and a half, 2 centuries, but particularly within the past century, and particularly even further within the past half century after the Immigration Act 50 years ago, over 50 years ago. Wow. So that's like the context. First is Métis, the biggest is Latino, the most widespread or widely seen or known is Creole, and then most vocal, haha, is Hapa, which is interesting. So the consideration is recognizing those characteristics. The consideration is understanding or recognizing the interests, the tendencies amongst each ones, and how they coincide, but also how they differ from each other, and how that can be reconciled. Because that's the point of this soliloquy today: is reconciliation amidst the differences, amidst the conflict. So, uh, like I said, I'm setting aside Métis and Latino for this particular consideration at the moment, and focusing on Creole and Hapa. So going further detail about uh, the Creole experience, what the interests are, what the characteristic is, what the interests are, and additionally. So whilst I say that Creole is maybe considered the most widespread or widely recognized, widely visible experience of melange on this continent, it's actually extremely suppressed for many, many reasons. Actually, for a few reasons, but for very severe reasons. I mentioned before that the experience of Creole exists for centuries, predominantly in the initial experience. It exists between not even marriages, but rapes between slave masters and slave women, European slave masters and African slave women, and children born of that coerced union. Um, and then they're emerging a hierarchy or a conventional hierarchy amongst the children of these unions, where the children, to varying degrees, are provided with special treatment, either because of carrying the lineage of the master, or oftentimes there's also the slave driver, or the overseer, or somebody else who had less authority on the plantation. But either way, um, the children of these unions being provided with special treatment, either because of being the hereditary descendants of the individuals who are the purveyors of the plantation, or because the phenotype is increasingly similar. And so in terms of like a divide and conquer type of methodology, it's a matter of providing specialized treatment to those who increasingly look like the ones who are um, claiming power within the plantation. And so, those are just words that I communicate. It was severe, and it continues to be very severe tactics and methodology of harsh penalties towards people who work in the field, who tend to be of increasingly dark complexion and African phenotype, and then preferential treatment for those who work in the house, who, as maids and butlers and even skilled workers like carpenters and additionally. So there emerges envy, there emerges additional angst and hostilities amongst all the slaves, because even usually the Creole brethren are slaves, but sometimes they're provided with additional opportunities for earning freedom, buying freedom, or just being outright set free in a conventional sense. So, anyways, that continues for centuries, and it's severe because the the pain is severe, and eventually, particularly within the past century, even as people of African ancestry are emancipated politically, um, quote unquote, uh, and people of African ancestry establish independent communities, rurally, suburbanly, urbanly, and additionally. These favoritisms in an increasingly self-managed context continue because the connections with Eurocentric convention continue as well. So many people of many Creole brethren who have, again, increasingly lighter complexion, provide educational opportunities, going to universities, studying, and becoming professionals. And additionally, um, and whilst many people of African ancestry or exclusively of African ancestry or darker African phenotype are continuing to work in labor, physical labor occupations. So as the Creole community emerges or becomes increasingly populous, there become like social orders. And particularly when families are considering marriage between other families, it's a matter of, okay, how dark are they? How light are they? Are they like us? Are they going to receive the same kind of preferential treatment that we receive? And are they going to fit in with the social hierarchy that certainly experiencing certain benefits from, as being not even second class citizens, but third or fourth class citizens as opposed to fifth class citizens? And so there is a very strong apartheid type of segregation, apartheid culture amongst people of African ancestry, Creole and otherwise, according to mixed heritage or not mixed heritage. And so that resentment continues. And just as there's a certain amount of aversion of light-skinned Black folk, or AKA Creoles, towards dark-skinned Black folk, AKA pure Africans, however you want it. All of these terms are charged, inaccurate, and BS, but that's what I'm just going because you know what I'm saying, presumably, effectively, continually. Just as there's that preferential treatment, that subordination or discrimination against people of African ancestry exclusively, people who are exclusive of African ancestry, there's also very strong hostility and antagonism from people of African ancestry towards Creole, towards people of lighter complexion, calling them sellouts, Uncle Toms, inauthentic, half-breed, this, that, and the other, sellouts, betrayers, this, that, and the other. And that continues to this day. And it's fueled, again, by conventional um, norms, but it's also fueled by selfish interests within each community, particularly within the context of those conventional norms. So when a leader arises in the African community, community of people of African ancestry, um, there are certain standards of how to evaluate that individual based on authenticity, how loyal the person is, hi, and additionally. And so the discrimination goes both ways. And the point, the running point with this is that it continues to this day, even though it's not addressed or openly. Additionally, the same accusations, the same power plays, the same animosities, the same standards of apartheid and discrimination and devaluation exist today. And it's extremely severe, to the point that where people who are Creole, like myself, are very extremely discouraged as even identifying as Creole, because then I'm claiming to be like white or better. I'm trying to get preferential treatment because I'm honoring my European ancestry. And so I avail myself to the scrutiny, the criticism, the lambasting for trying to be something I'm not, quote unquote. And so there's extremely strong hostility towards people even just identifying as Creole, self-identifying as Creole, which is why so few people do it. And so when I say that the large population of Melange on this continent is Creole, the vast large percentage of such individuals don't identify as Creole because they just identify as people of African ancestry because of that hostility from Africans, from people of African ancestry, but also of people of European ancestry, because um, there's the notion, there's actually the law of anybody of any type of African ancestry being just black and not white. So the line is very strictly drawn. And so when somebody identifies as multiple heritage or mixed heritage as African and European, uh, the person is categorically legally denied and rejected by European convention because, oh, that person has African ancestry, so they're not white. And then the person was also severely ostracized, demonized, dehumanized, and additionally by people of African ancestry because, oh, they want to be a sellout. Oh, they want to be this and the other. And so there's this ethnocentric limbo that Creoles historically exist within when identifying as such. And so it's because of the norms, and additionally it's easier and pragmatic to just simply identify as being of African ancestry, and then try to be as perceived as authentic as possible or down for the cause as much as possible when called upon or when challenged or questioned accordingly. So um, that's one of the reasons why there it's estimated to be over 30 million people of African ancestry on this continent, just in the United States. And out of that 30 million, it's very safe to say that probably over 25 million of those people are Creole, have some type of European ancestry or some other type of ethnic ancestry as well. However, the amount who actually identify as much, who recognize that, is extremely low. Probably, let's see, the mixed population is somewhere around 6 million, so somewhere around there, maybe actually around 9 million, somewhere around there. So Creole probably identify, it would be difficult to say because I don't think the US Census takes that type of information, but estimate would probably be like maybe less than half of that number are actually people of Creole, maybe half. So maybe 5 million. So out of the 25 million that are actually Creole, 5 million actually identify as such readily, openly, on at least a piece of paper, let alone in public and in public discourse. So very small percentage because of some very severe conditions. I'll give you an example for like today at universities, typical universities, PWI, predominantly white institutions. There is a when keeping a census information, demographic information about student population and ethnic identification, the category of mixed race is provided appropriately. It's usually the option of selecting further than one ethnicity, or there's an actual category that says multiple heritage or mixed heritage. That's a typical conventional standard these days. And so um, typical percentages tend to be like 3%, 4%, somewhere around there, depending upon the university. Um, Now, I went to an HBCU, a historically black university, and uh, doesn't even include the category mixed, even though the vast it includes people of African ancestry, European ancestry, I think Asian, maybe Latino, and maybe I don't even know if others involved is included within the options. There's no blank space. There's no mixed, and I think 98% of the population identifies as people as black, as people of African ancestry. Um, so that's what it is. That's the stats on the book for decades since I've been there, and I've checked it in the past year or so, and it's still that way. So 98%, noventa ocho. Now, of that 98%, I'm speaking from firsthand experience just by being on campus and knowing the student body as I do. 5,000, 6,000 students, cinco mil, seis mil. Easily 80% of those people are mixed in some way. Maybe great great grandfather or great great grandmother, somebody like that. But when you look at the phenotypes, it's very evident. It's the people are other than all African. Um, but identifies such. So that's an example of the severity. Like at the HBCU, the category isn't even available to identify where that's the conventional norm. So, anyways, that being said, that is one reason why when we look at institutional infrastructure today, for in the melange experience, why Creoles are very under proportionately represented. I think I said that right. Um, in terms of leadership and organizations. There are some, but given the numbers and comparison with other melange denominations or however we want to describe that, Creole should be very up there in terms of the leadership and being founders and investors and contributors to melange organizations. However, the actuality is today that the vast majority of melange organizations and groups and startups in addition are founded by Hapa. So why is that? So we can look into the Hapa experience. So as I mentioned before, Hapa Asians live on this continent for centuries as well. comparatively modest numbers. The geography is predominantly on the west coast, but on both coasts and in the Midwest and South in addition. Um, it's and Hapas exist, and I'll give honor to the term Hapa itself because it's a native Hawaiian term and it's controversial in its own right because it's a Hawaiian term and so people claim it as the propriety of native culture and native brethren, native Hawaiian brethren, with due honor and respect for native Hawaiian brethren and native Hawaiian sovereignty. Um, there's the consideration. First of all, the word means mixed, and it refers to brethren who are mixed with Hawaiian and predominantly Japanese or some other Chinese ancestry who live on the Hawaiian island about a century, or actually a little bit further than a century ago. And so the native would just refer to the children born from these unions as hapa. And then there become like additional qualifying terms like hapa haole, and additionally that refer to the type of mix the person is. But basically, hapa just means mixed. So the question then becomes: so who has the propriety over that word? Is it native Hawaiians or is it mixed people, mixed Hawaiians? Now, fast forward a few decades, few generations, as migration continues, and many of the people from the Hawaii move, relocate to the west coast of the continent of mainland. They continue utilizing this term hapa, and simultaneously, the Asian population on the west coast, from south to north, all the way to from the Tongva land to the Okanagan, from San Diego to Vancouver, and additionally, the Asian population increases. And as the Asian population increases, particularly after the Second World War, and particularly through the Immigration Act, a a decade or so after the Second World War, the Hapa population significantly increases. Um, and the Hapa population, Hapa meaning in this particular case, people of mixed Asian ancestry and predominantly Japanese and Chinese with European brethren. So the Hapa brethren, the mixed Asian, Eurasian brethren are introduced to this term Hapa, and particularly in the 70s and 80s when people are looking for cultural identity and there's this increased kind of like, I don't want to dismiss it as pseudo militants, but this consciousness of pro ethnic culture. Mixed Asians begin to utilize the term Hapa to identify as mixed Asian and to own that kind of experience. So that's how it begins. So then, but people accuse mixed Asians or Eurasians of appropriation for utilizing a Native Hawaiian term to describe oneself, to self-identify, even when one is not of Native Hawaiian ancestry. But then the question becomes, again, who owns that term? Is it Native Hawaiians or is it mixed Hawaiians? And if it's mixed Hawaiians with other Asian ancestry, then is there some type of duly appropriate kind of linkage or heritage or inheritance amongst all mixed Asians? So anyways, that's just a side note about the term Hapa. I continue to utilize it, again, with all due respect to Native Hawaiian brethren. My ancestry includes Native Seminole, which is a lot further east of Native Hawaii, but I have a certain amount of credibility in the Native cause to have a certain amount of authenticity in my continued utilization of the term Hapa to describe mixed Asian brethren, and still be pro-Native Hawaiian brethren as well. So that's another conversation. Hapa. Again, the Hapa population increases in the post Second World War Immigration Act, and there, there's obviously a significant cultural linguistic distinction between Asian civilization and European civilization, and particularly a charged contrast with the world wars, particularly between Anglo civilization and Japan, and then also with the challenge of China, and particularly as China becomes communist in addition. So obviously there are challenges linguistically, politically, religiously, and additionally. However, there's also a strong congruence, and there's less of a charged kind of animosity and a continuing animosity between races. So that There is an increased amount of welcome is a little bit of a strong word, but there's an increased amount of like comfort space for Hapas to like explore this experience of being mixed, of being melange, and to abstain from choosing one side or the other. It still exists. That tendency and that discouragement continues to exist, particularly over half a century ago. But compared to the Creole experience, where people were actually killed and lynched and done all the types of ways for crossing borders, and additionally, um, there's an increased amount within the Hapa experience. There's an increased amount of uh, comfort space to identify and to maintain allegiance in one way or another. There's still a strong assimilation tendency, but there's additional room for that kind of identification. So in the 70s and 80s, when there's this uprising or this upsurgence of pro-ethnic identity and cultural identity, additionally, um, mixed mixed melange, mixed heritage organizations become a thing, and mixed race studies and advocacy, and additionally becomes a thing. And many of the groups that emerged during that period are actually Hapa, or at least Hapa led, as a part of a consortium with additional Melange brethren. And that continues actually through this day. We can look at the Maven Foundation and the Mixed Heritage Center. We can look at um, the Hapa Issues Forum. We can look at the Critical Mixed Race Studies Conference. Um, we can look at leaders like Dr. Maria P.P. Root. We can look at Kit Fulbeck. We can look at Loving Day. We can look at additional things as well. So all led by uh, either exclusively Hapa or significantly by Hapa brethren. So many of those organizations start in the 80s, like wow, 40 years ago, haha. Uh, and even, but some of these begin within the past decade, and even looking at new recent emergences like Hapa Mag, and additionally Hapa Palooza, um, uh, and additional organizations, still is the trend even after decades of the pattern. So, and when we look at Creole. There's Creole involved with critical mixed race studies to a comparatively modest extent. There's the Mixed Remix Festival. Um, there is Reginald Daniel, who actually is a colleague, a direct immediate colleague of Dr. Maria P.P. Root. Um, so there are Creole brethren who are doing organizing and leadership. However, we can look at Mélanger Ethos Institute, yours truly, and additionally. Um, so there are Creole brethren that are doing things, but again, um, the numbers are still unofficial in terms of like how many Hapa there actually are, and how many Creole there actually are. But based on just anecdotal experience and estimation, given the numbers, Hapas are extremely representing compared to Creole, and understandably. So those are the conditions, those are the characteristics, those are the conditions. Now we get into like the conflict or the contention, the tension between Creoles and Hapa, because obviously they're distinct experiences. They're very strongly shared experience. But there's also a different politic. There's generally or widely different priorities, and thus different agendae. Um, so the consideration is one, recognizing that, then further like identifying that what is it, what are the distinctions, and then identifying how can these be bridged, how can this be reconciled, and how can this be increasingly cooperative. So we can look into the general socioeconomic, religious, um, and linguistic uh, experiences amongst Creole and amongst Hapa. So um, there, there's so much that can be identified with. I'll just look at share like some of like the main kind of joints. So we can look at if we're presuming Creole to be people of European and African ancestry, and we're presuming generally Hapa to be people of European and Asian ancestry, um, we can recognize, particularly on this continent, both existing within the context of a Eurocentric convention, and then thus we can recognize the different experiences that each respective ethnic community, African and Asian, experience with the European convention, and so it may be considered that, generally speaking, even though many African heritage leaders abstain from speaking to this effect, the vast interest amongst people of African ancestry is separation. And that's a very strong word that makes it militant nationalism, this and the other. But Black folk don't want to be part of the society because the society is intrinsically racist. And we can look at the U.S. Constitution. Again, I flex my law degree in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 of the U.S. Constitution. It's fundamentally racist, classist, and genocidal. And so Black folk know that without even studying that. And so don't invest much in it. Now, some have kind of like it's just a different methodology of how to separate from that, whether it's generation by generation by generation, and additionally rising through the ranks and then changing it within the system, and or if it's like right here and right now, off the land and additionally. So there are a lot of different options, but the point is, categorically widespread, people of African ancestry don't buy into the system. And may have errors that they do, and additionally, but I'm sharing just very candidly, matter of factly, people don't. And so the politics, the economics, the religiosity is all shaped, colored accordingly. So, and thus it can be understood that the experience and the interests, the priorities of Creole brethren who identify and maintain connection in the different communities, European and African, are shaped, colored accordingly as well. And when we look at people of Asian ancestry, there's less of a concern about the intrinsic racist, classist, and genocidal nature of the U.S. Constitution because who's perfect? And there's the further consideration, the further propensity of continuing prosperity within a U.S. system. And so separation is less of a concern, less of a priority, maybe dealing with injustices, um, tweaking the system here and there when it becomes unavoidable. But otherwise, hell, it's cats are getting rich off this. Let's feed off this too. So there's less of a motivation of like fundamental change or this, that, and the other. It's just a matter of, oh, we can how do we optimize our experience within convention, within the status quo. And so again, that is that influences, shapes, colors the interest, priorities, and agenda within the Asian community, and that shapes, colors, and influences the agenda of Papa Brother, particularly the priorities. And so that may be considered like the most significant kind of like temporal distinction. Religion is actually another significant one as well, and it'd probably be a little bit difficult to delve into that at the moment. Let's see what we can do. So from the Creole side, religiosity, first of all, comes from a multiple, obviously, of a multiple experiences. There's the Eurocentric side and there's the Afrocentric side. The Eurocentric side coming from a predominantly Protestant background, Christian, and the African side coming from African tradition, um, and then being forcefully converted into Christianity by and large, and then experiencing other avenues of religiosity, whether it's Islam, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Buddhism, Baha'i. Um, those are like the majority of the paths of people of African ancestry on this continent. Um, I can think of it. So, but the vast majority are either Christian or agnostic, and so we can make certain presumptions about the political, economic, and social characteristics and interests and priorities among such individuals as well. One other factor to consider is that amidst all this, the religiosity, the politics, the history, the culture, and everything, language is also a significant thing because literally African languages are beaten out of African folk, and thus English is a very strong uh, anchor and reliance. There's a very strong reliance on the English language for people of African ancestry and also people of Creole historically to speak. And when we compare that with Hapa, again, religiosity from the Eurocentric side, again, predominantly Christian Protestant. And then from the Asian side, we have Tao, we have Confucius, we have Buddhist. We also have Christian, particularly within the latter parts of the past century. Um, but though the vast amount is a little bit different, and again, there's agnostic and atheist, and additionally, um, but where the predominant experience amongst African and Creole may be considered um, uh, Protestant Christian, it may be considered that the predominant experience amongst Asian and Hapa is actually a mix of um, Tao, Confucius, Buddhist, and a smaller amount of Christian. And so again, that shaped and influences the politics, economics, and additionally. But the distinction, though, is linguistically that many Hampa are increasingly immediate with the native or the ancestral Asian language, whether it's Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, and additionally Thai, and additionally um, there is there's a higher linguistic proficiency amongst Hapa of multiple languages compared to Creole that significantly relies upon English, and that is a significant factor in terms of economics, politics, as amidst the experience of globalization, economic, employment prospects, and additionally perceived viability from convention of who can we send out to do this, that, and the other. Who do we know? Who can we trust to do this job in some other country? Who has a command of the language? Um, Language is an increasingly um, uh, lucrative skill set. And so and that matters that Hapa has. And it's not just a matter of profession, it's a matter of like knowing one's own ancestry, knowing one's own heritage and knowledge of self, being able to study scriptures and traditions and cultures, rituals within a language. And there is that strength. And so that's something that not all Hapa have, but a large percentage Hapa seem to have compared to Creole. And so again, that shapes that sense of autonomy and self-sufficiency, and the ability and the chutzpah to start an organization, and to identify as mixed, because being called less into question about authenticity. Oh, I can speak this, I can speak that. So what are you talking about? And so that plays a role into it. Now we go into like the challenges. So those are some of like the intrinsic kind of distinctions of priorities and policies, particularly as I described the politics. So the consideration is, how do Hapa and Creole find joint interests, joint experience, joint priorities, for that are mutually beneficial, genuinely mutually beneficial, and favorable. An example of this exists within the census campaign a couple centuries ago. Let's see, I must be getting fatigued at this point. Uh, a couple decades ago, depending on which calendar you're utilizing in the past century, but at some point, uh, mélanger, mixed organizations, uh, cooperate with each other. The American Mixed Ethnicity Association was active during that period as well, out of California, the land of the Oleon. And so these organizations established a concerted campaign, a cooperative campaign, to include the category of being mixed, or at least to be able to include further than just one ethnicity on the U.S. Census. And so this is something that affects all people, and it's a pragmatic thing, but it's also an esoteric, existential kind of cause as well. And it's one that is shared by mixed people, and it was big, and it was successful. It happened, it's influential because it continues to provide people of all these kind of heritages and denominations, and additionally, that space to identify as such, and further programming, and additionally to emerge from identifying as such. So that's an example of the joint efforts. But the Critical Mixed Race Studies Conference and journal is another example of joint interest, academic studies, further substantiating, advocating the Mélanger experience. I mentioned that it's started predominantly by people who are Hapa, but also there are Creole and additional mixed brethren out there as well. So that's another example. But that's been around for a couple of decades at this point, and the consideration is progressing, advancing further, because there's still a whole lot of needs, particularly internationally. And I think that's where like the crux emerges, because where Hapa are have a general tendency or lack of interest in um, working outside of the domestic box of the United States. Creoles are increasingly motivated, generally, of working outside the sovereignty box of the United States, and building cooperatives, and additionally with other agencies, other organizations in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, and additionally in the Southwest Quad, and additionally. However, that takes some doing to step outside and to like build bridges across the sovereignty box, outside the domestic box. Um, there's a lot of effort that's needed for that. It's a concerted effort, not just a matter of like reaching out to people, but like legally setting up organizations, establishing economic activity, and additionally, it takes some doing. And so where Creoles and other mixed brethren may have an increased amount of interest, and actually where Hapa may have an increased amount of forte and a skill set for doing that. As I mentioned, the continuing linguistic and even familial connections with the Asian heritage. There's less of a political motivation for doing that, because the United States is extremely uh, confining when it comes to cooperation outside of the domestic box of the United States, because it's perceived as lessening the authoritativeness of U.S. convention, because if people are increasingly connected with outside foreign interests, then people are less reliant upon the domestic interests and the monopolies or the oligopolies that exist domestically. And so there's very strong um, uh, impediments towards that type of cooperation, and directly but also indirectly, where if somebody participates in that, then they may be prevented or excluded from other opportunities domestically. And so help us have additional amount of options or uh, factors to consider when deciding to do something that is international, transnational. And so whilst Creoles may be very motivated for that, Hapas may be somewhat hesitant and reluctant. So that becomes an issue. And the consideration is uh, finding the mutual interests and benefits and priorities, the balance and the compromise that genuinely serves the interests and the well-being of not just Creole and Hapa, but all Mélanger brethren and all people of Earth collectively, because that's the nature of Mélanger, and that's the nature of the benefit that Mélanger provides. So I'm at this for probably like 40 minutes at this point, 40. So I need to like keep on keeping on and wrap up because I got some other obligations. Um, I will share one other thing, and this is just the first course. So there's another course after this. It's less flowery than this, actually. Um, but in wrapping up this joint, I will I'll share another another concern. And my intention was to focus increasingly on this particular concern. But at this point, I've talked a lot already, and um, I've stretched it at this point. So I'm gonna just address it because it's important to address, but maybe leave that for another session. But here's another consideration. Um, Amongst the leadership of Hatba Brother, um, there's the consideration of how much Hopper Brethren effectively appropriate the suffering, particularly of Creole Brethren, as a premise for advancing Hopper interests in the guise of mélanger advocacy. So by that I mean this: guilt is a strong motivating factor, and it's not all powerful, but it does have a certain amount of sway in public policy and additional. And when a community flexes a certain amount of guilt and offers a solution or a compromise that is increasingly agreeable to what other people may be advocating, then the convention is increasingly motivated to provide that lesser kind of watered down version of compromise. So an example of what I'm talking about is Loving Day, and organized, started by a brother, dear brother, Ken Tanabe, who I talked with through the years. And to be honest, to his credit, he's one of the cats who actually returns my calls, and returns my calls soon, expediently. And so respect for him for doing that, and for being receptive. And I've actually brought this concern with him, and he's actually agreed with that. But simultaneously, there's a continuation. So I'll explain what I'm saying. So, Loving Day is a celebration, an annual celebration of a United States Supreme Court case where anti-miscegenation laws are invalidated by the United States Supreme Court. This is about 50 years ago, and the name of the married couple is Richard and Mildred Lovey, a brother, an uncle of European ancestry, and sister of auntie of African, Native, and European ancestry. They were married in the state of Virginia in the land of the Cherokee. It was against the law. They were set in jail. They were told not to see each other again, and they took the case to court, and it went to the Supreme Court. Uh, exactly during the period of the Civil Rights Movement, additionally, which was very quiet in certain circles, but it happened, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Virginia law was unconstitutional, and so that's called the Loving decision that allowed effectively mixed race or mixed ethnicity marriage. And so Ken Tanabe, about a decade, actually probably over a decade or so ago, in hearing and learning about that case and being Hapa himself and a mixed brother, um, decides to start a celebration on the day of, I think it was the day of this court decision. It's in the middle, it's the summer, June. But to have a celebration to honor the Lovings and the experience of mixed ethnicity marriage. So positive, celebratory, informational, educational. Nice, beautiful. Now here's one of the challenges though. One, first of all, it's predicated upon a U.S. Supreme Court case, which again, the U.S. Supreme Court is still based upon the U.S. Constitution, and it's still a racist, classist, and genocidal institution. And so even the uh, dismantling the anti-miscegenation laws is still just like a partial kind of like partial. I mean like a minuscule kind of allowance of pacifying uh, a continuing adherence to um, a xenophobic and oppressive system. So I say that lovingly, um, but that's the actuality. So it's like, okay, yeah, it's fine. Now you're saying people can get married, but it's still bad. And by it's still bad, I mean like there's still the law still dehumanizes people. It just says that you can marry a dehumanized person. That's basically what it's saying. You can look the law up, but that's what it says. Um, so it's like it's not even a half. It's not even like a 50% victory. It's like a what doesn't even matter how much the percentage is because it's not enough. So I brought that up with Ken Tanabe's attention, and Brother Ken says, yeah, he recognizes that, but he wants to do something that's educational. So okay, fine, cool. But here's the challenge. This is a celebration that um, it is educational, it's informative, it is grassroots based, so that it encourages people to start their own celebrations and organize. I've actually organized one here in the Cuyahoga area a number of years ago. People actually attended. I can count them in. I shouldn't count the number of people in one hand, but almost. But so I've done my best to support that. But again, it's based upon a Creole experience, and Creole suffering, and not just Creole, but African enslavement and apartheid and discrimination on this land. And so it's conjuring that kind of guilt experience as a premise for having a celebration for all mixed people. So that's cool, but when we do that, we have to be accountable to the well that we're digging in, to support that. And it's beneficial to be educational and informational, but simultaneously, when we look at the imagery, um, it's a lot of party, and so parties are cool, but then we have to be careful of it being reduced to just an excuse to have a party. And it doesn't take very much motivation for people to do that. And there seem to be increasing educational opportunities, that can emerge from that experience. So that's one of the continuing concerns. Um, and that's one of the examples of the uh, tension or the distinction of priorities and interests, and agendae amongst our collective Melange brother. So that being said, there's tremendous propensity for continuing cooperation, and to manifest these opportunities, it is incumbent to recognize the challenge and to commit towards the communication and the interaction and diligence in finding and implementing the solutions. Um, and honesty is a pervasive component of that. Love is a pervasive component of this, and modesty, the willingness to make compromise, and to be flexible. In addition, is an intrinsic component of this as well. So that being said, I'm gonna leave it at that. Now, dos cosas. Here's the second joint. It's fairly brief. Like I said, it's less flowery, so it's further grittier, but it's increasingly brief, at least for the moment. Um, it addresses the experience of LGBTQ. So I talked about this on a number of occasions before. However, um, this particular consideration emerges from recent audience of a number of uh, communications, YouTube videos, and additionally, um, that express the LGBTQ experience. Um, and from these communications, what is recognized is that LGBTQ is actually a religion. Um, it is a way of belief. It's other than a human right per se. It's a way of being and way of belief. And one of the significant implications of that is that um, it relies upon, um, or at least at this point, it emphasizes other people's uh, condonement or acceptance of LGBTQ behavior, LGBTQ lifestyle. And unless somebody does that, then the person is considered to be homophobic and hostile and antagonistic and hateful in addition. Um, so when LGBTQ is recognized as a way of believing, it's basically a denomination of secular individualism, um, and the notions of personal liberty, and additionally that LGBTQ is predicated upon. When we look at secular individualism as a religiosity or as a religion, then it's easier to see LGBTQ as a denomination of that type of religiosity. Um, and when others are solicited to accept that, then it's increasingly evident of the inappropriateness of that solicitation. Um, every person is deserving of respect. Every person is deserving of love. Every person, every individual, every being is deserving to love. That's without question. So that's fundamental. And I get into my spiritual thing because this is the realm that it goes into. So what I'll say is, on the behalf of myself and my ilk, we believe that the divine presence exists within every being, and is due very very proficient consideration, treatment, respect, and support and well-being. Everybody, every being. So that's whatever, regardless of what the person does. Even if that person is a mass murderer, dictator, whatever, still they still deserve it. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that everybody does is acceptable or should be accepted. There's a propensity for having disagreements, and LGBTQ is one of these experiences, one of those things where disagreement. Don't have to agree with that, and I don't have to, and people don't have to sanction and approve of people's ability to practice LGBTQ behavior. It is comparable to smoking weed, or gambling or something like that. People don't people do it. Some people do it. Some people don't do it. The people who do it abstain from saying that everybody has to agree of that person doing it. Same thing with LGBTQ. So you say, wait a minute, you said LGBTQ is a religion, now it's gambling, it's smoking weed, make up your mind. It's all that. So the point is that there is a certain amount of um, conventional, social, political, correct kind of leveraging where obviously uh, men and human civilization have done so many woeful things for so many millennia, for so many centuries, generations, through this day, of um, atrocities towards each other, men towards men, atrocities towards women, um, uh, rape, pillaging, and murdering, and prostituting, and all this other thing, heinous stuff. Again, this is where the conscious, or the guilty complex and influence comes in, because LGBTQ historically, in my experience, and working with dear LGBTQ brethren, has a very keen knowledge of these atrocities and a certain amount of willingness to address these. But it is widely manipulated for the purposes of advocating LGBTQ interests. Even we can look at Amnesty International, and additionally, where Amnesty International is one of the forefront human rights organizations internationally, worldwide, and probably there are very few organizations that probably know as much as the Amnesty International does about human rights violations and the violators in addition, and speaks to that only because people who are in control, or I should say that, people who are in authority position, um, don't call out other people in authority position because they know what they're doing accordingly, and can be easily called out as well. So just hide from it, ignore it as much as possible. Amnesty and other human rights organizations additionally talk to it. However, at the same time, Amnesty equates basically and actually devalue or deprioritizes human rights atrocities like warfare, like poverty, like human trafficking. Yes, they talk to that, but there's a deprioritization compared to other things like sexual productive rights, LGBTQ afflictions, in addition. So when you look at the Amnesty International website, yes, there's things about orphans and refugees, and additionally, but it's often right below LGBTQ protests and policy interests and additional um, uh, policy priorities that Amnesty advocates. And so it effectively becomes, wait a minute, so yeah, you're talking about refugees and orphans and this and the other, but is it just because you want additional attention and certain credibility for advocating these other interests? Now that's a harsh accusation, but I've been in the game for decades and I've seen enough of it to say, oh, listen to that. Now, my point with that is that there is a recognition of the limitations of the PC culture amongst LGBTQ, and the recognition of the self interest and motivations, even when addressing and even advocating for other human rights interests and topics. Um, so, and when somebody calls things like that into question, someone is called a homophobe, this, that, and the other. And then all these other things are accusations and criticisms are thrown into the water to murky it up and to blur the issues in addition. Um, so I share that as it is. And one of the reasons why I share that, again, this is those folks. What does that have to do with anything? I'm just sharing this. It has everything to do with everything, but it is a distinct topic for today. Um, but the consideration is that when I view these recent communications, um, I become increasingly privy to the general state of human relationships these days, and how much these deteriorate, and what is perceived as like the standard for a healthy relationship. How much of it is sexually charged? How much of it is selfish and superficial? Uh, Lacking a lot of depth and meaning. How people are like using each other for either sexual gratification or social gratification or social mobility, socioeconomic mobility. In addition, it's mutual predatory behavior, and there are very few people, it seems, and very few groups or communities that are speaking credibly, authentically, and directly towards this experience. Um, because in one way or another, even when a community may have certain amount of like credibility when it comes to sexual um, discipline, and additionally are involved in other types of exploitation in addition. So um, it's difficult to call out, and the purpose is not for belittling anybody or demonizing or dehumanizing anybody. The consideration is just recognizing like people are hurting, and like relationships are hurting, and it seems like many people have difficulty recognizing even like what a healthy relationship is, having trust, and that's I'm speaking about myself too, knowing what it's like to like uh, to be in a relationship, regardless of what the relationship is, whether it's husband and wife, whether it's brother and sister, whether it's child and parent, whether it's teacher and student, friend and friend, or whatever. To be in a healthy relationship, um, where there's like trust and communication, and there's um, an, a comfort away from concerns about why this person is in the relationship, or uh, just waiting for the objective, if that's getting a job, or whether it's getting a promotion, or whether it's getting um, uh, whatever favor, whatever else. Um, to get beyond that kind of mutual using each other. Um, uh, that might seem very cynical, very harsh. Again, my fatigue factor, I have to articulate. Um, but there's a concern about what people consider to be norm, what people consider to be um, available or possible, um, and how to identify what a healthy relationship is, um, and how to maintain a healthy relationship accordingly. Trust, modesty, selfless love, but also self-caring love as well. Um, balance, communication, and communication is an emphasis because amidst all the different ways we stay in touch with each other, through social media, through mobile phones, through I presume people so these days, um, and additionally, there's a lot of interference. There's a lot of go-betweens that are facilitating the communication, and when there are these go-betweens, um, there's an increased amount of dissonance compared to just face-to-face, in-person communication. Um, and so there's doubts, ghosting, and this, that, and the other. Uh, trolling, catfishing, and additionally, robocalls. Uh, there are all these other factors that are involved in many of the predominant methodologies of communication that adversely affects communication, so that where the majority of conflict communication is silence, and shared silence. But when the communication is done over large distances with a lot of interference in between, a lot of go-betweens in between, that silence is very much subject to uh, uncertain interpretation, uh, not being confident in how to translate that silence. Um, so uh, I'm starting to ramble at this point, or continue to ramble at this point. So I'm gonna just wrap it up. Um, that's a concern, and the LGBTQ experience proclamations are um, a an example of that lack of awareness of healthy relationship. One other thing I'll say about LGBTQ is that it's unsustainable. It relies upon uh, uh, outside emergence within the cause. And that's something to consider in terms of the predatory nature of it. And people can talk about being born a certain way, and additionally, uh, but I share that for consideration. In a similar way, people can talk about certain religions being unsustainable, particularly those religions like Christianity, like Buddhism, and additionally that effectively espouse celibacy and monasticism. Um, those methodologies obviously are also effectively unsustainable if all the practitioners were actually to duly 100% practice that. And so that could be accused of certain predatoriness as well. I'm saying from agreeing with that categorically, but it does warrant certain conversation, and ain't available for the moment to do that. So I drop heavies as I complete this joint. But that's where it is at the moment, unsatisfactory. So we try to conclude on a positive note and without doing too much strain to think of something to transition the previous topics into something increasingly positive, readily, directly, evidently. Um, I share blue jays that I see yesterday flying on a tree, bright blue wings amidst a pale gray sky. And I'm watching trees planted, actually, at the moment, green, green, green on a winter day. The air is getting colder, somewhat rainy. The hazy gray sky is visible through the skylights. The soleil light permeates through the condensation and it reflects within and from all the light that travels about in my immediate presence. It's a beautiful thing. It's a colorful thing. It's a miraculous thing. So much love, so much vitality. There's the paradox that life is only complex when we expect others to love, which might seem like a challenging thing, but as that actually, when we look at it in optimism, it's actually a miraculous thing. There's some presumption, but there's also a certain guarantee within that as well. Life is beautiful. It ain't always easy. Within every day, there are blessings and there are curses, and the curses are classes for us to learn lessons, to do better, to share better. That's our purpose in this life. We all have our different propensities, our different skill sets, our different scar tissue, and our different muscle tissue. But we are each provided with gifts. And these gifts are tremendously valuable to others. The universe is in need of it. And the universe is generous in providing it as well. It's up to us to find peace, to find harmony in the balance, in the process, in the path, however we do that. We can understand heaven in many different ways. We can understand earth in many different ways. And when we are on this earth, we are each wrestling with heaven. We each got a different style of wrestling. Many styles, many styles. That's a reference. And part of the endeavor, again, is finding the cohesion, the compatibility, the cooperation. So I leave it at that. Namaste, assalamu alaikum, shalom, zaijian, adios, teja grease, simpin, asamu, kile, one love and peace.